friendly neighbors, and welcome back to our channel! None of my ferrets are really in a holding mood today, so I guess that's all we're getting out of them being in this video. Besides them being loud in the background, but that's just a staple at this point. Today we are moving on to part 2 of my series where I'm talking about kibble and commercial foods. And this video, as opposed to last video, is a little bit more, targeted and on topic. Today we are going to be talking about all of the different types of commercial foods, their advantages, their disadvantages, and then finally I'm going to be letting you guys know which one I think is the best for ferrets. Before we get going on that, I am going to give my 2 important disclaimers for this series. First one is ferrets are very complicated. Please make sure that you are watching the rest of the videos in this series if you're someone who is looking to feed your ferret a different brand of food or check if the brand you are feeding them is appropriate. Only watching one of these videos is going to be taking things out of context and you might be then making the wrong decision, and I don't want that to happen, so please watch the other videos. Second disclaimer, I'm not a vet, a scientist, or a nutritionist. I'm just someone who's very passionate about ferrets and I spend a lot of time doing research about them, and that's why I'm making this series. Third disclaimer, my camera angle is bothering me, so I'm gonna adjust that really quickly. Commercial food. Before we get going with the different types of commercial food, I feel like I should probably define commercial food. Commercial food basically just means any pet food that you can buy from a company, whether that's buying it online or buying it at a store. There are 5 different types of commercial foods. You have kibble, canned, air-dried, freeze-dried, and raw. For the sake of this series, I'm not going to be talking about raw commercial foods. If you're curious to learn more about raw commercial foods and how to tell if a raw food is or isn't appropriate for ferrets, I do have other videos and another series on that, so go check that out. I'll have it linked in the description. For the sake of this series, when I'm saying commercial food, assume that I'm referring to the other 4 types, not including raw. There just isn't another word that I can find to describe food you buy at a pet store that is cooked without saying food you buy at a pet store that is cooked. And I just don't really want to say that every time, so I'm just sticking with saying commercial food. Now that we've got that over with, let's break down each individual type, and I want to talk about each one of them. So the first type of commercial food is kibble. I'm sure we're all very aware of what kibble is, as it is the most popular type of commercial food. The advantages to kibble are that it is highly available, so pretty much any pet store you can walk in and you'll be able to buy kibble. There's also so many different brands that you have so many options of what you want to feed if that's the road you're going to be taking. And the last advantage to kibble is that it is cost effective. Of all the different types of commercial foods, kibble is generally speaking the cheapest. Now, what about the disadvantages of kibble? Unfortunately, there are quite a few disadvantages to kibble. The first is also variety. Because there's so many varieties of kibble and different types, there are lots that are not suitable for ferrets and not suitable for cats and dogs. Why are we selling these foods? They are awful. So because there are so many different types with different ingredients and components that are possibly dangerous to ferrets, you really need to make sure you've done the research on the brand that you are choosing to feed your ferret to make sure that it's appropriate and something that they're going to be able to live off of. Another disadvantage to kibble is that it is highly processed. Kibble needs to be cooked at a very high temperature in order to turn it into a powder and then to turn it into the shapes that it needs to be in order to be kibble. And because of this, it loses quite a lot of its nutrients. The higher temperature something is cooked at, the more nutrients it loses, and these nutrients then therefore need to be added synthetically back into the kibble in order for it to be considered complete and balanced.
The problem with adding these nutrients back into the food synthetically after they've been cooked out is that we don't actually know how well ferrets and other animals absorb synthetic nutrients as opposed to natural ones. There have been studies done on how well human beings do this, and what we've found is that some nutrients aren't absorbed as well in their synthetic forms. So, it's possible that foods relying heavily on synthetic nutrients may lead to deficiencies, despite meeting nutritional requirements on paper.
On the same train of thought of kibble needing to be a certain shape, in order to get to that shape and be able to pack together like that, kibble contains a lot more filler than all of the other commercial brands of food. In the case of ferrets, filler basically just means anything in the kibble that isn't an animal protein or any of the vitamins and minerals added to it that ferrets need for their diet to be complete. So this can be grains, vegetables, fruits, anything that sort of falls into that category. These are all things that ferrets can't process because as obligate carnivores, their bodies don't digest fruits, vegetables, and carbs. So they're basically in there for literally no reason other than to make the kibble form into the shape that it's in. The second type of commercial food that we have is canned or wet food. Canned and wet food is something that I don't really see a lot of people talking about when it comes to feeding ferrets, which I find strange because it is a completely relevant option and there's a lot of really awesome brands out there. There are lots of benefits to putting wet food into your ferret's diet. The first one being hydration. Canned food is wet, there is more water in it, that's how it's preserved, and because of that your ferrets are getting a lot more hydration when they're eating it, as opposed to something like kibble, which is pretty dry. Water, of course, is very important to all living things, including ferrets. Dehydration is bad for literally every single part of an animal, from their liver and kidneys to their oral health. Ferrets are really small and it is super easy for them to become dehydrated, and dehydration can go from being just mildly dehydrated to a life-threatening condition in a matter of hours. Water is just really important, is what I'm trying to stress, okay? Water, please. Another advantage is that generally speaking, canned foods have less filler in them. Because canned foods, unlike kibble, don't need to form into a specific shape, they don't need all of the added vegetables, fruits, and grains in them in order to get them to that shape. A lot of the brands of canned food that I see and I think would make excellent options for ferrets actually don't have any filler in them whatsoever. It's just the meat and any added vitamins and nutrients needed to consider it complete. And lots of these higher quality foods, when you're looking on the ingredients list, instead of just having, chicken or chicken breast, they actually include organ meats and stuff as well, which are really awesome whole food sources for the vitamins and nutrients that ferrets need. Because of how canned food is preserved, it doesn't need to be cooked at as high a temperature and as long as kibble, which then means that it has more natural nutrients in it because, as we said earlier, higher cooking temperatures deplete nutrients. Canned foods are also typically higher in fat, which is really, really important because ferrets turn fat into energy and it's an extremely important part of their diet. Like I said last video, there was a study done comparing the digestibility of commercial food between ferrets, cats, and dogs, and the study found that ferrets need more fat in their diet than cats do. So, canned food. And the last benefit of canned food is that, generally speaking, and of course depending on your individual ferret, canned food is more palatable. It smells worse, so they like the taste better. And it just tastes more like meat. So it's just a more natural flavor for them. Now, as much as that list of benefits sounds really wonderful, of course there are disadvantages to canned food still. The first disadvantage is that canned food is definitely more expensive than kibble. No matter what brand you're looking at, the canned version is going to be more expensive. Second disadvantage is that it does lead to some pretty stinky poops. Generally speaking, when it comes to feeding ferrets, what goes in sort of resembles what comes out. And when you're feeding your pet a stinky, slimy, wet food, what comes out might be that consistency. Sorry. The last disadvantage, which is probably the biggest disadvantage of canned food, is that it is very bad for oral health. Cats that are on a diet of only wet food have significantly worse teeth than cats that are on a diet of kibble. And this also is going to depend a little bit on your individual ferret, but generally speaking, they're going to have worse teeth when it comes to wet food. The third type of commercial food is air-dried food, also sometimes called dehydrated food, depends on the brand. Air-dried food is food that has been very slowly air-dried at a lower temperature at a longer period of time. The first advantage to air-dried food is that because of how it's cooked, it once again preserves more nutrients than kibble. It's not cooked at as high of a temperature, so it gets to retain some of those nutrients. The next advantage is because of how it's cooked, it doesn't need as much filler in it in order to keep its shape. A lot of the air-dried foods that I find out there are 95% or more animal ingredients, which means that there's really not a lot of filler, and I love to see that. Now, what about the disadvantages? The first disadvantage is the price point. Air-dried food is significantly more expensive than kibble, and that's just a reality of it because it contains more animal ingredients and it just takes more work to make. The second disadvantage is just that it is super dry, and that can once again lead to dehydration if your ferret isn't getting enough water. And the last commercial food that we're going to be talking about is freeze-dried food. Freeze-dried food is food that is frozen and then dried. As far as its advantages and disadvantages go, they're pretty similar to that of the air-dried food. So just like an air-dried food, they have less filler in them and more animal ingredients, and they're more nutritious than kibble. Theoretically, freeze-dried food is more nutritious than air-dried food because the freezing process before the drying helps retain lots of the nutrients, but I wasn't actually able to find a conclusive study on how much more nutritious it was and if that actually was the case. I found a lot of blogs claiming that it was more nutritious and claiming that there had been studies done, but after 2 weeks of intensively searching for these studies, I have come up empty-handed. A little tangent on that, this kind of highlights the importance of sourcing and not just taking someone's word as being truth. There were a lot of blogs claiming that the American Cancer Research Association had said that freeze-drying food retains 95% of the nutrients. I saw this on at least 15 different blogs, and I was never actually able to find the point at which the Cancer Research Foundation said that, So I don't know where they were pulling this quote from. I think it was thin air. Scientific sourcing, people. Don't just trust it because you read it on the internet, no matter who said it. Okay? Thank you. Even if I said it, don't trust it unless I have a source, or I'm saying, hey, this is my opinion, just so you know. It's an opinion. Doesn't mean it's a fact. Okay, we're gonna keep going because I was very passionately angry about this morning. Just like the advantages, the disadvantages are pretty much the exact same as air-dried food. It's expensive, it's dry. That's it. That's the disadvantages. So now that we have an understanding of the 4 different types of commercial food, I'm sure you're all sitting there asking yourself, okay, Kenya, but which one should I feed? And which one is the best for my ferrets? Spoiler alert, they're all the best. Variety. It is one of the rules I talked about in my first video on this series. Variety is so important no matter what diet you're feeding, whether it's a raw diet, a commercial diet, a homemade diet, your ferret's diet, your neighbor's diet, variety. The following section is something that is very opinion-based. I will have a couple sources and stuff throughout it to back my opinion, but this is all formed from the research that I've done and my own experiences working in the pet food industry. If you are feeding your ferret a commercial diet, I think that you should be practicing rotational feeding. What is rotational feeding, Kenya? Explain these things to me. Rotational feeding, it's a relatively self-explanatory term, but it refers to feeding your ferret in a rotation. So you're rotating through different brands of food, different proteins, and different types of food. Personally, I think that you should be offering your ferrets at least 3 different brands, types, and proteins. But if your ferret is willing to eat more the merrier. Rotational feeding is something that has become a little more common in recent years. I certainly hadn't heard about it until a couple of years ago, and now I have quite a few people at my work who do it, and they swear by it and say their animals are so much more healthy ever since they started doing it. But it is important to remember that just like everything to do with ferret nutrition, it is completely theoretical. But it is theoretical with anecdotal evidence and some really clear benefits that I definitely think support the idea of doing it. So let's talk about those benefits. The first benefit is that it helps to avoid nutritional inadequacies. Dr. Jean Dodds has a really awesome article on rotational feeding, its benefits, and why you should be doing it, and I definitely recommend giving it a read through. I will have it linked down below. In the article, she says, no one dietary formula, no matter how complete and balanced it is, can meet all of an animal's nutritional needs over an extended period. In her article, she compares rotational feeding to how we as human beings feed ourselves. She says that no matter how healthy a food is, if that's the one thing that we eat our entire life, we are going to end up nutritionally deficient. And that is completely and entirely true. Human beings can't survive on one single thing, just like your ferrets can't survive on one single thing. And I think that especially with ferrets, this is extremely important. We don't know the nutritional requirements of ferrets yet. It hasn't been studied, and we're really just taking guesses. Because of that, by doing a rotational diet where you're feeding a bunch of different foods, these foods can work together to fill the gaps with each other. Because we don't know the ferret's nutritional requirements, it's possible that you might pick a food that looks really great, but without you knowing and without anybody knowing, they're deficient in some sort of trace mineral or vitamin or something that we just don't have an understanding of how much of that thing ferrets need in their diet. So if you're accidentally feeding this food without knowing it, your ferret might end up with a deficiency in that certain nutrient. But if you're feeding it rotationally with a food that just so happens to have an extra amount of that trace mineral, that second food is going to fill the gap and help your ferret have a more well-rounded diet, without you even knowing that that's happening. And along with that, bodies, human bodies, animal bodies, they just aren't meant to eat the same thing every day for their entire lives. In her article, Dr. Jean Dodds really does say it best, and I don't think I'm going to be able to come up with it better, so I'm just going to read exactly what she has to say. Our bodies run on rhythms. Most of us sleep when it's dark and are active when it's light. We feel differently in winter months than in summer months. We crave different nutrients when we're sick than when we're well. The same is true after we exercise. In other words, the nutritional needs of humans and animals vary depending on many factors that are constantly changing. Breaking an animal's nutritional requirements into life stages, separated by many years, or by specific condition, greatly oversimplifies their physiological complexity. If you continually feed the same food, over time your pet can become deficient in some nutrients. Varying the diet brings in potentially missing nutrients, allowing the body to self-correct. And that's just the first benefit of rotational feeding. The second benefit is that it prevents your ferrets from becoming picky eaters. I am sure any ferret owner out there is aware of how picky ferrets can be when it comes to their food. Ferrets imprint on their food at a young age, so it's super hard to get them interested in new things or to even try new things. But if you are constantly switching between different flavor profiles and different foods that your ferrets are eating, they're eventually going to become less picky because they're going to realize, oh, there's a whole world of food out there that I can eat. This is something that I have personally noticed with my ferrets. The more things that I get them interested in and the more things that I try to get them to eat, the more willing they become to try new things. And this branches off from just the different raw foods they're trying, it also relates to treats. When my ferrets were younger and before they were on a raw diet, if I introduced a new treat to them, they wouldn't even go near it. They would just be like, what is this? Why are you trying to do this, mother? Now, if I offer them a treat, they'll sniff it, and if they don't eat it, they'll at least put it in their mouth and stash it somewhere to eat it later. Pretty much anytime I'm buying them treats now, I actually try a different bag to see if they're gonna like it. And they surprise me pretty regularly by being willing to eat it when, like I said, previously they wouldn't go near new treats at all. The third benefit is that it increases their water intake. If you are adding a canned food into their diet, which I very strongly recommend doing, I think that you should have canned food in your ferret's diet. This means that they're gonna be getting more hydration. We've already talked about dehydration and ferrets, so you guys know that hydration is super important. The fourth reason that rotational feeding is important is that it reduces the risk of your ferret developing an intolerance or an allergy to the food that they're eating. Just like someone who's been on a vegetarian diet for their entire life, trying meat for the first time is probably gonna get a little bit sick. If your ferrets eat the exact same food for their entire life and then one day they try and eat something else, they're also probably gonna get pretty sick, because their body just doesn't know how to digest this new thing. As ferrets age and health conditions come up, it's possible you're gonna realize that the food you're feeding needs to be switched to something else. And if you have a ferret that's been eating the same thing its entire life and you're trying to suddenly switch it to a different food, it might not end well, because they're possibly going to have developed some sort of intolerance to any food besides the food that they've been on for their entire life. Along with that, many vets are starting to theorize that the reason so many animals nowadays are developing chicken and beef allergies is because it's the only protein that they've been eating for ever. Being fed the same thing your entire life is just really bad for your body, and that's what pretty much all of this comes down to. And the fifth reason, which is a little bit more minor, but I don't know, I still do want to bring it up, is that if you are feeding your ferret one brand of food and then one day it gets discontinued or for some reason you aren't able to get it anymore, it's gonna be a really rough position for you to have to suddenly switch them to something else when they've been so used to being on the other thing for their entire life. As someone who works in the pet food industry, I can just tell you how often food just randomly gets discontinued with absolutely no warning, and I've seen a lot of dog and cat owners end up in pretty precarious situations when they have a super picky animal that doesn't want to switch to a different food and suddenly the food they're feeding isn't available anymore. You just don't want to be in that position. It's just not a good time. It's really not. So those are the 5 reasons why I think that you should be feeding your ferret a rotational diet. And a couple notes on that, just because I don't want to lead anyone astray by accident. If you have an older ferret that's been on the same food for a really long time, it's possible that you're not going to be able to switch them into something else or onto a rotational diet. Like we talked about earlier, their body is just probably really used to digesting that certain type of food, and it just might not be worth it to put them through the digestive upset of having their digestive system relearn how to digest something else. But keep in mind, if you are trying to introduce your animal to a new kind of food, loose stool and a little bit of an upset stomach is something that is relatively common. Just keep an eye on it, and if it does persist for a concerning amount of time, then maybe call it quits and decide that switching isn't going to happen. Make sure you've seen the first video in this series, because I go through a guide of how to introduce your ferret to a different type of food, and that might be useful to you if you have a ferret that's got, a little bit of an iffy stomach. And lastly, don't try and introduce too many things at once. Once again, if you have a ferret that's been on the same food for a really long time, dramatically changing their diet is just not going to be good for them. You need to have patience, and you need to do it slowly. Well, gosh, golly, thank you guys for watching this video. I hope that you guys maybe learned something, or you thought of some ideas for how you want to change your ferret's diet. I don't know, I'm here to help spread education and spread my opinions and my experiences. So yeah, hopefully I did that. Or you just hung around because you like hearing me talk. Which, why? Why? I have such an annoying voice. You need to get your ears checked. Check out my Etsy page. My new business boxes just dropped. They are slumber party themed, and they are, once again, as per usual, every month. Super cute. I also have a couple ferret bags on my Etsy store that I posted because they were overstock items, and once again, they're also really cute. So if you want a cute little ferret bag, check those out. Do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because by doing all of those things, you too can become a citizen of the friendly neighborhood, which, in my personal and professional opinion, is the very best place that you can be. I'll see you guys next week when I talk more about Kibble, and probably talk for too long, but that's just how this series is. Goodbye!